As I explained in my previous video, I've had to leave London and I'm outside London, and this is unfortunately constraining my ability to make videos to some extent and to carry out the usual broadcasting and publishing work that we do of the Duran. I hope, however, that I'll be able to continue, if only up to a point, to provide you all with some sort of update service. But my videos are going to be shorter, I think, and perhaps rather more generalist than the videos that I've been doing up to now. Though, as I said, I will continue to the best of my ability to comment about the situation. One thing I will say is that it's always useful to travel outside London because, of course, it gives one a good sense of what's going on in at least the English regions, which are the parts of London which I travel to. Usually when I travel out of London, it is to the Midlands and sometimes to the sort of northern areas of England. This time, I should say, I'm in the southwest, a different part of England from the usual parts of England that I travel to, and already I formed some impressions. But I will discuss those probably on a specific video with the Duran on my return from London. In the meantime, back to the topic that I talk about all the time now in all my programs on this channel, which is, of course, the conflict that's going on for the time being in Ukraine itself. Now, military situation over the last couple of days has become incredibly difficult to read. My overall sense is that the general policy of the Russians is to be as quiet as possible about what their long-term plans are, as General Surovikin, the Russian commander-in-chief, said in that one interview he's given on Russian television about 3 weeks ago, that his primary plan is to build up defences on the front lines, to harden the front lines, to build up reserves, and to, as he said, grind the Ukrainians down. And as I've discussed in previous videos that I've made, my previous video specifically, that is to a great extent precisely what the Russians have been doing. We're getting more and more reports about the scale of Ukrainian casualties. They are extremely high, and there may be some dispute about how high exactly they are, but the fact that the latest mobilization that the Ukrainians have carried out of 100,000 men is to replenish existing forces as opposed to creating new ones shows, to my mind, two things. Firstly, the fact that the pool upon which Ukraine can draw for more mobilizations, more manpower, is now to a great extent exhausted. Ukraine can't continue to bring in more and more tens of thousands of troops to its military. I suspect that there simply aren't enough officers now and soldiers, even with the help of countries like Britain and France and the European Union and the United States to train all these people who would be brought up. And there probably aren't enough command staff in Ukrainian military formations, actual officers, to lead more tens of thousands of troops, even if they were mobilized. But anyway, the point is that the mobilization pool, the ability to mobilize more men, has now been exhausted. The Ukrainian army lacks the ability to do that, to absorb hundreds of thousands of more men, to form new formations, and it's highly likely anyway that those men aren't there anyway to be called up in those kind of volumes. So the fact that Ukraine is only calling up 100,000 men points, as I said, to an exhaustion of the manpower pool and to the ability of the Ukrainian army to absorb additional forces. And the second is, of course, as it's replenishing existing losses. That's the only way I can understand what the Ukrainians are saying. Well, it looks as if the guesstimates that we've been hearing from Russian sources that Ukraine's losses are in the region of 100,000 men, guesstimates which are based upon figures that the Russians themselves, the Russian Defense Ministry, has been giving. Well, that looks as if those guesstimates may be approximately true. Now, as I've discussed in previous videos, that would be a fifth of the combined forces that have been serving in the Ukrainian military since the start of the war. A horrendous level of loss, and one which cannot be sustained indefinitely, whatever some people may think. So Surovikin is successfully, from his point of view, his army is successfully grinding the Ukrainians down. He's building his forces up, and he's keeping his cards very close to his chest. He's not telling us very much about what he intends to do. And nowhere is the lack of clarity or information greater than over Kherson and what is going on there. Now, last week we had that bizarre episode of the flag on the administrative building in Kherson city, the fact that the Russian flag wasn't there. That led to a wave of rumours that the Russian military was about to pull out of Kherson region, something which turned out to be not the case, or at least there's no sign of it for the time being. But at the same time, we are left in extraordinary ignorance about what the actual situation in Kherson region is. And a journalist, or rather I should say a military commentator on the pro-Ukrainian side from the United States, I believe, or perhaps anyway from the West, Michael Kaufman, has just been to Ukraine. He always takes an optimistic view of the state of the conflict from the Ukrainian side, but he admitted that even from the Ukrainian side, the situation in Kherson region is, as he put it, as clear as mud. We don't know exactly what is going on in Kherson region. But the indications are, the latest reports from the Russian side of the internet, the Russians are always much more informative about what's going on the battlefields. Anyway, the latest reports from the Russian side of the internet suggest a build-up of Ukrainian forces, that Ukrainian brigades have been re-equipped with armoured personnel carriers, wheeled armoured personnel carriers from Britain and France, and that they are supposedly preparing to launch an attack on Kherson, and that a Ukrainian tank brigade has also been deployed to support this infantry assault, but that apparently there are reports that some of the soldiers are unhappy about this. They don't have much confidence in the ability of their armoured vehicles to withstand Russian artillery fire, and of course the weather conditions remain extremely bad and not conducive to an offensive. What is indisputably the case is that there's been heavy artillery exchanges between Russian and Ukrainian forces starting on Saturday. And sometimes, though not always, these artillery exchanges are precursors to some sort of offensive operation by one side or the other. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But the fact is, as of the time of making of this program, the Russians are still in Kherson city, they're still in Kherson region, they're still evacuating civilians from Kherson region, but there is no sign that the actual army, the military itself, is evacuating from Kherson region. And as I said in my previous video, it looks as if the Russians have created, or are in the process of creating, fortified lines, and that for the moment the indications are that they're prepared to make a fight, to stand and fight in Kherson region, and that the Ukrainians themselves are perhaps none too keen on launching this offensive, at least for the moment. I'm going to come to that last point later in this program. Anyway, there have been fewer reports from other parts of the front line, but there has been one set of reports which I've seen on various channels, Russian channels again, and they suggest that the Russian advance on Pavlovka and Vuhledar has not gone well, that the Russians have got bogged down in Vuhledar. There's lots of complaints about the fact that there have been heavy casualties there suffered by the Russian forces, and that the supply lines are overstretched because of the muddy conditions, and that the Russian forces in Pavlovka are now subjected to heavy artillery strikes. And I've seen one rather angry Russian commentary about this attack on Vuhledar, which has said that somebody in the Russian command, we don't of course have any idea who that is, that one particular officer decided that he would order an attack on Vuhledar, and he did this with insufficient forces, a lack of infantry, and that the attack was not sufficiently strong, and the result is that the battle to capture Vuhledar has not gone well. Well, that's one commentary. I'm going to say, though, that there's been a whole stream of other reports which speak about fighting in Pavlovka and Vuhledar still taking place. Well, again, I'm not a witness to these events. I can only draw conclusions from the reports I'm getting. My overall assessment is that the Russians are indeed stopped in the advance on Vuhledar, though whether it's quite as much of a debacle as that rather angry commentator suggested, there just isn't enough information at the moment for anybody to say. Further north, however, in Donetsk region, we've been getting a whole scatter of reports about advances by the Wagner Group and associated Russian forces in Bakhmut. And again, it's incredibly difficult to get much sense of what's actually going on there, but certainly it does seem as if some kind of advance is taking place in Bakhmut. And there's even a report, but then we've had many of these reports in the past, that the Ukrainians are now accepting that Bakhmut will fall at some point, and that what they're trying to do is set up a further fortified line in Donetsk region further east. I have to say that if the Ukrainians are thinking about setting up fortified lines further east in Donetsk region, after Bakhmut, after the fall of Bakhmut, Solidar, and all of those places, it looks to me, if all these reports that I've been getting about the importance of Bakhmut being the linchpin of Ukrainian defences in Donetsk, if they are going to lose Bakhmut city, then, I've of course said this in the past, but I'm going to repeat it again, I think perhaps the wiser strategy would be to pull out of Donetsk and the Donbass altogether. And I'm going to come back to the implications of that again later in the programme. For the rest, Russian missile attacks, drone attacks on the Ukrainian energy system continue, and there's now more reports, and they're starting to appear in the Western media as well, that the Ukrainian authorities are indeed giving serious thought to removing the civilian population from Kiev. That will be 3 million people. Again, no real explanation of where those people would go. I've discussed that in previous programs. I can't help but think they will end up going to Western Europe. But anyway, that's a scattering of reports that have appeared. There have been articles about this evacuation of Kiev in the New York Times and in the Guardian, and that may very well be indeed what is being planned. Now, all of this perhaps overshadows what was perhaps the most interesting event of the last few days, which is the visit of President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, to Kiev. And this was a private visit, or at least this was a visit, understandably enough, kept very secret. But obviously we were informed about it eventually, and he seems to have met all sorts of important people in Kiev, including Zelensky and the political and probably the military leadership of Ukraine. But of course, we haven't had a full explanation of what he was doing there. Now, this is a mysterious visit in some respects, but it does point, it might be connected with a number of things. Now, on the 8th of November, and I'm making this program on the 6th of November, on the 8th of November, the United States has its midterm congressional elections. House of Representatives is due to be re-elected, as is a third of the Senate. And across the United States, there will be votes in many gubernatorial elections, and of course in many local congresses, state congresses as well. And the indications are, and of course this is only indications at the moment, that the Republicans are looking to win big. And some people in the Republican Party are basically saying that if the Republicans regain control of Congress, then there will be, at the very least, much tighter control over funding, the funding that is provided to Ukraine, or perhaps even a cessation of that funding altogether. As to the second, I am extremely skeptical that that will happen. I very much doubt that there's anybody in the Republican Party, or maybe there might be a few people on the populist fringe, but I suspect the mainstream, the bulk of people elected to the Congress will not want to be put in a position where they're blamed by the Democrats if Ukraine collapses. But I do think that there's probably a head of steam now starting to build up, which strongly suggests that unconditional support for funding Ukraine from Congress is going to become much more difficult once the new Congress meets and begins its activities in January. And of course, probably from the perspective of the administration, or at least some of the people in the administration, that might even be the least of their worries. Ukraine, one senses, is very important for some people in the administration, probably for President Biden, doubtless for his foreign policy team, Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland and all those people, perhaps even some hardliners in the Pentagon and in the intelligence agencies. But my guess is that a lot of the Democrats, the Democratic Party, the various other people, the Democratic Party operatives, those sort of people, their primary worry will not be what happens in Ukraine, but rather what happens in the United States if the administration, in the middle of a recession, finds itself facing a hostile Congress. And already there are rumblings and rumours that more investigations are going to be launched over a certain person's laptop. I don't want to be too specific. You will probably understand why. Over possibly other things, election related conceivably, and of course perhaps conceivably even about Russiagate itself. And of course if the Republicans win big, even if they don't get a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which, to be straightforward about it, is out of reach, even if the Republicans win big, quite possibly they will pursue investigations and conduct investigations. And of course, if they're able to undermine the president's reputation, which they might be able to do, then it's not inconceivable that we could see impeachment proceedings being brought at some point. Partisan feelings in the United States are so strong that I think that is highly likely. But beyond that, and on top of that, the president and his administration are going to find themselves in a very difficult bind in terms of their overall program, a very ambitious program that they announced when the president was elected. The president himself is old. There have been problems with his memory. Again, I think you all understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, there is going to be, we are looking at the likelihood of a political crisis in Ukraine, in the United States. Now, if that is the case, do these people, do these rather tough political operatives in the Democratic Party, do they really want the president, the administration, the political energies of the administration distracted by what's going on in Ukraine? Especially given that if things start to go badly wrong there, then of course that could feed Republican criticism of what the Democrats are doing, of what the president has been doing. So there is that concern. Now, in the run-up to these midterms, a couple of weeks ago, there's a whole bevy of articles in especially the Financial Times, talking about the importance for Ukraine of capturing Kherson city by mid-November. Supposedly, weather conditions would make offensive operations impossible if that didn't happen by then. And I was puzzled by this because, to my knowledge, weather conditions are principally a problem, not by mid to late November, but by late October, during the autumn period when the mud set in, which is, of course, the period we're in now. But then, of course, it occurred to me that mid-November, roughly, 8th November to be precise, maybe not mid-November, but near enough, is the time of the midterm elections. And sure enough, a short time ago, we got another report that the Biden administration was pushing Ukraine to try to achieve some kind of victory in Kherson region, to capture Kherson city by the 8th of November before the midterms, so that the administration could provide some evidence of some kind of a victory before the midterms took place. Well, that is now looking unlikely. I mean, it could be that over the next 2 days, there will be a Ukrainian breakthrough in Kherson region, and that they might capture Kherson city in that time. I mean, these things happen in war. It's not impossible. I can't say that it is impossible. But on the basis of the information I have, that looks extremely unlikely indeed. But, of course, there is another possibility, which is that even if the administration loses badly in the midterms, the Democrats lose badly in the midterms, the administration, people like Jake Sullivan, might still want some sort of victory in Kherson before the new Congress convenes in January. And some reports are now circulating that one of the things that Jake Sullivan came to talk about with Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials was the situation in Kherson and the administration's growing frustration with the failure of Ukraine to capture Kherson city. And it could be that this is correct, and those reports suggest that Sullivan extracted promises from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian officials, that the offensive to capture Kherson city would resume this coming week. And this is of course consistent with the artillery fire, the heavy deployment of forces, all of that which we've been hearing so much about. Now, why might the administration want Kherson city to be captured or to achieve some kind of victory in Kherson region before the new Congress convenes in January? Well, the short answer is, if there is total deadlock in the war over the next few weeks leading up to the new Congress in January, meets at the very end of January, goes into session at the very end of January, well, it's going to be much more difficult for the administration to keep the whole Ukraine policy together, to get any kind of help from the new Congress at all, if the Republicans are able to say, well, you committed all this money to Ukraine, you've given them all this money, you've given them all this equipment, you've given them all this help, and the war is at a standstill. You're not making any gains. So I can imagine Jake Sullivan saying to himself, the administration saying to itself, well, we didn't get this victory in Kherson city before the midterms, and that's a major problem. But at least if we can get a victory in Kherson city before the new Congress convenes, well, that will put us in a stronger position to confront that Congress at the end of January. Now, that brings me to a further point about this whole Kherson offensive, which is that it's become increasingly clear to me that Ukraine, the administration, have over Kherson become trapped into a narrative. They said they've been talking since, well, for months about this offensive in Kherson region. The first reports I saw about it were way back in March. I remember the Daily Telegraph in Britain writing articles about how Russia's control over Kherson was slipping and that the Ukrainians were on their way to liberate Kherson city from the Russians. And of course in June we were starting to hear stories about this Kherson offensive, and in July there's been more reports, and of course it was expected to happen in August, and it was delayed right up until the end of August for reasons which are still not fully explained. But anyway, there were all those reports, there was all this uncertainty about Kherson and what was going on there. And the fact is, both the West and Ukraine have been talking up this Kherson offensive relentlessly for months, that if it fails, if it doesn't end in the capture of Kherson city, well, the effect on morale in Ukraine and probably support for Ukraine in the West is going to take a very big hit. At some point, they have to show results, or at least that's the pressure on them. So that's why we see these constant attacks on Kherson region, or towards Kherson city. Heavy losses being inflicted all the time. Probably a very large proportion of the losses Ukraine has been suffering are being experienced in this particular region. But they can't simply stop these attempts, because to do so would be an admission of failure of something which they promised would succeed all the way back in March. Now, it's entirely appropriate and correct at this point to say that the Russians are also, to some extent, trapped in their own narratives. I mean, the Russians, after all, have promised that they will clear Donbass and protect Donbass from Ukraine. The Russians have talked about, they've incorporated these 4 regions into Russia. The Russians also have committed themselves to making Ukraine a neutral country and, in effect, purging Ukraine, as they say, of a certain ideology. So they're obliged to sustain the war, to achieve these objectives, because, of course, if they fail, then again there will be a sense of great demoralization in Russia. But of course the Russians have enormous resources that they can constantly draw upon to try to make their narrative true. Ukraine, it seems to me, is running down its limited resources by trying to make its own narrative work. Now, putting all that aside, there's something else that Sullivan may have come to talk about in Ukraine. We've now had articles appearing in the Washington Post, a newspaper very close to the administration, very close to its thinking, and it's been echoed also by The Guardian, in which the administration, the reports say that the administration is worried that Ukraine's absolute rejection of negotiations with Russia, a position, by the way, that the Americans and the British persuaded Ukraine to adopt back in April, when they, in effect, sabotaged, torpedoed the agreements, the draft agreements that had been reached in Istanbul. That this refusal by Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, what it is doing is undermining support for Ukraine amongst the US's allies. And I suspect not just its allies, but I suspect also amongst most countries in the world. Now, I think that is true, and I think that there might have been an event which brought home to the United States the extent of skepticism about Ukraine's position more than any other. Obviously, this has been apparent for a long time, but there was a very interesting debate and vote in the UN Security Council about a week ago. Now, the Russians came along and were talking about all the information they have about various laboratories that they found in Ukraine. They wanted an investigation of what was going on there. There was never the slightest chance that that investigation would be authorized by the Security Council. The United States has rights of veto on the Security Council, and of course it voted against the Russian proposed resolution, which only China voted for. Well, what must have worried the United States was that though the Russian resolution failed, as it was bound to do, and though the United States had the support on the Security Council of its Western allies, all the other big powers abstained. All the other countries, the non-aligned countries, collectively abstained. These include countries which up to now have tended to vote alongside the United States in Security Council meetings. So this vote highlighted perhaps the extent to which the non-Western world is in effect repudiating the United States version of events in Ukraine. And this has come shortly after the decision by the OPEC Plus producers to cut oil production, something which the United States was most unhappy about, to put it mildly. And of course, it's also come after the various natural gas producers, Qatar, I believe Algeria as well, have been expressing their growing opposition to the idea, which has been floated within the European Union, of a cap on natural gas prices. Now, this is the same problem as is being experienced by the oil price cap idea, which is, of course, that the idea of capping the price of Russian oil, internationally traded Russian oil, has met strong opposition from other oil producers who do not like seeing the United States and its club of consumer states Western states dictating any part of the price of oil, and the natural gas price cap idea, which by the way isn't only limited to Russian gas. Apparently that's also triggering alarm amongst gas producers like Qatar, that again the West is taking it upon itself to try to dictate natural gas prices, which of course the producers see as a direct challenge to their commercial position. So this is, we're starting to see some signs of a retreat on the oil price cap idea. It's now been apparently accepted by the United States that if a country buys gas from Russia, buys oil rather from Russia, it can resell that same oil at any price it wants. This is already something that is going to undermine the whole idea of the oil price cap, because to make it very clear, this is a mechanism for laundering oil, Russian oil, which is already going to undermine the oil price cap idea even before it started. But it looks as if the gas price cap idea is also now going to encounter enormous problems. So the United States has to be concerned, and is justifiably concerned, no doubt, by the fact that this stance of not negotiating with Russia, which Ukraine has taken under British and American encouragement, is now weakening the overall British-American position. The problem is it's going to be very difficult, I would have thought, to get Ukraine to shift its position. It's going to create real problems in Ukraine if it does. But I wonder whether, again, this is what part of what Jake Sullivan was about, whether he didn't go to Kiev perhaps with a view to getting the Ukrainians to shift position on that and to start negotiations, or to rather agree to start negotiations with the Russians, something that the Ukrainians have been resisting up to now. And this could be justified, and reasonably justified, on the basis that, as I said, this refusal to engage in negotiations is undermining the US position. But is that really the only reason why the United States might be trying to push Ukraine towards negotiations? Isn't it more rational that if the United States is trying to push Ukraine towards negotiations, it isn't just because it wants to mollify international opinion? When, after all, has the United States been so concerned with international opinion that it has changed its foreign policy in recent years? Well, I can't think of a single case. Is it not more likely that this story about the United States wanting to get Ukraine to start negotiations because failure to do so undermines the international position of the United States as it tries to mobilize support for Ukraine? Isn't it possible that this is a story that's been put about in order to try to push Ukraine towards negotiations? And is it not just possible that the reason that the United States is now pushing negotiations, or at least the administration is pushing negotiations, is because, shall we say, somewhat more rational people within the administration, within the political system in Washington, are now starting to say that this is something that must now happen. After all, despite all that we read, Ukraine's military and economic situation is deteriorating. It's suffering, as we've discussed, enormous losses. It's absorbing Western weapons at a rate that I suspect nobody in the West expected, and in a way that is depleting Western arsenals. It's also facing an economic collapse, the loss of energy, possible mass migration flows towards Europe, everything which points to a debacle there, a military debacle there. And of course, at the same time, the administration is going to be faced with a massive political challenge once the Republicans regain control of Congress, as they look likely to do in a couple of weeks when the new Congress convenes. And on top of all of that, there is this gathering sense of economic crisis. Energy costs are rising, interest rates are rising, inflation remains stubbornly high and may still be rising. The whole of Western Europe is descending into depression or severe economic recession at the very least. And all of this setting the scene for a bitterly fought presidential election in 2024, with a strong probability that Donald Trump will be a candidate, and with all the fears of what might happen amongst Democrats if Donald Trump is re-elected. So I can imagine that political operatives on the Democratic Party, the more political wing of the administration, the part of the administration that's more concerned with domestic issues, power within the United States, are now pushing for some kind of diplomatic process to at least try and moderate the sense of crisis and to try to bring some kind of end to the conflict in Ukraine, at least to try to stabilize it in a way that will give the Democrats and the administration some more breathing room going forward. But this, of course, goes hand in hand with that need to achieve that victory before the new Congress convenes in January, which is why we see more arms packages, Sullivan apparently egging the Ukrainians on to launch another massively destructive offensive towards Kherson city, a policy that I suspect has two aspects and which is now becoming contradictory. There's also the problem that anybody who calls for negotiations within the United States and indeed in Europe, as we have repeatedly seen, faces massive opposition from the neocons and the other hardliners who have a lock grip in the United States on the State Department, on parts of the intelligence community, parts of the Pentagon, and which receive massive funding from the various companies that produce the weapon systems that are going to Ukraine. So even if there is this policy of pushing Ukraine towards negotiations, doesn't mean it will win out in the United States. I can imagine that if Ukraine does sit down to negotiate, well, that could actually deepen the crisis in the United States. Except perhaps in the event of one eventuality, which is that Ukraine achieves some kind of a victory in Kherson region. We always come back to Kherson region. So the United States, the administration could say, well, we won a victory in Kherson region, our policy has been successful, Ukraine is now in a strong position, it can sit down, it can negotiate with the Russians on that basis. Well, is that what's going to happen? Are we going to see these two conflicting policies pursued in the way that the administration, or perhaps some more moderate people, think? Is that really what Sullivan was just talking about in Kiev? Well, I think it probably was. One can understand the twin track approach. Offensive towards Kherson region, victory in Kherson region, and of course at the same time a push to get the Ukrainians to sit down and start negotiations with the Russians. Problem, I think we can, I think that this is a fairly likely, in fact a very likely, what he was saying when he went to Kiev. After all, on the one hand, we have these reports about, pushing an offensive towards Kherson region, more arms packages, and on the other hand, we're getting these reports in the Washington Post and the Guardian and other places. Except the reality is, if Kherson region is recaptured, the administration is not going to get what it wants, because the hardliners, both in Kiev and Washington, will say, well, we got the Russians on the run, let's continue the war. This whole situation is a trap. I don't really see a simple way out that the United States, or at least this administration, can follow, which doesn't complicate things and make things difficult. I'm sure, that military option that I was talking about in yesterday's video, the deployment of Western troops, of American troops to Ukraine. I'm sure if things start to go badly wrong in Ukraine, the hardliners will be calling for that, and we've already seen that they managed to get some American troops on the ground. Any idea that you can, however, try and avoid that, swerve the problem that we're looking at coming before us by winning a victory and then getting everybody to sit down and talk? Well, that isn't what happens in the real world. The risk, firstly, is that you might not win that victory, and the further risk is that even if you do, it will embolden the hardliners on your own side. So I don't think there is a simple way out of this problem. The only proper way out is for people in the administration, the economic agencies of the administration, perhaps the military ones as well, perhaps the Congress, to finally say, look, this has gone far enough. It must stop now. Kiev must be told that they must sit down and negotiate with the Russians, or all aid stops. And we, for our part, must now start to look at a way of ending the economic war with Russia. Overcomplicated diplomatic strategies, which is what I suspect the administration is following at the moment, never end well. That is almost a given. And in fact, they can often end up making things a great deal worse. Anyway, it's an intriguing fact that Sullivan has gone to Kiev. As I said, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've had those articles appearing in the Washington Post and the Guardian and all those other places. And at the same time, I also believe that it's true that he's egging Ukraine to attack Kherson city. One can just about understand what the administration is trying to do, but it's too complicated, and one way or the other, I'm confident that it will end in tears. A simple strategy of picking up the telephone, talking to the other side, sitting down and talking, looking for a peace, that's the only way to end wars. It took 20 years for the United States to understand that over Afghanistan. It took years also before the United States finally accepted the logic of this during the Vietnam War itself as well. We'll see how long it takes over Ukraine. Well, that's me for the day. I hope this has been helpful, and there'll be more from me soon.